It's now time for the closing session of our day. I should stay here. This is fun. Before we begin this last session, which will end after with the wrap-up, which will be done by Richard. One of our observators came and see me and said he wanted to add some comments regarding what we discussed before the break. So it's up to you.
I didn't want to delay the break for anyone that was needing it, but when on the discussion of user groups and consultations, I just want to comment and just to make sure that when this is developed, that we keep in mind not only discussing with users what users want, but also discussing with non-users what they would want and what we'd have to do to make them become users. In particular, I'm thinking of a lot of Indigenous communities, because as the descriptions are set up now, there's a lot of difficulty in describing a lot of Indigenous records because they come from a completely different knowledge paradigm, and I think that this could be a really good opportunity to make some bridges there and to perform some consultations with traditional knowledge keepers and other such individuals who are responsible for their own sort of customs of keeping knowledge and keeping recorded information, so that we can make this a standard that can be used across all different cultures, not just sort of the colonial apparatus that we've inherited, and maybe even use it to sort of unsettle and decolonize some of that. So that's all I want to say.
Could I say something to that? I think that one of the things to think about if we're talking about a revision, if we are going back to revisit principles, that this would be one of the first places that you might want to make a statement and either incorporate something of the sense of participatory archiving, which has been a model that's advocated in the Canadian Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, or just more generally, the social inclusion agenda, which has taken hold in a lot of jurisdictions and is causing not huge transformations in descriptive practices right now, but certainly there's a great deal of advocacy for incorporating other expert knowledge into archival descriptions through annotations, through tagging, through things like that. And there are a lot of really interesting projects going on in different jurisdictions. The Revisiting Collections project in the UK, for example, the Reciprocal Research Network project, that I think that's part of the, I think in terms of thinking about how we make this a uniquely Canadian standard, that's not necessarily distinctively Canadian, but do something that remedies defects in other standards. I think that's an excellent area that we want to investigate.
Thank you. So the last group of questions, group 6, concerns the revision roadmap and transitional strategies we want to use while implementing new RAD. So first question was, what are the priorities? How should consultation and revision proceed? What is a reasonable timeline? In French, a reasonable timeline for a project like this, we call that la question qui tue. A hard question. Second question was, what is required to support backwards compatibility should RAD undergo revision? Oh, and I didn't mention the results. Well, you have them, I guess. On the priorities, consultation, revision, and the timeline, Decide on structure alignment with international standards was the answer most often given. And what is required to support backwards compatibility? Crosswalks was the answer which came up on top. And second to last question, what resources and tools would the archives community require for transition to a new standard? With training coming out on top, followed by involvement of provincial and territorial councils, and, well, of course, we've talked about that, funding and crosswalks too, and others after that. And finally, please provide okay, well, that's not a question maybe we can go into right now, but yeah, general comments, which was delivered in another document, I believe. So, transition backwards compatibility, how do we go about?
Well, I think one thing that jumped out to me was just everybody really talked about the need for crosswalks and keeping whatever we come up with, being able to map it back to the existing RAD, so there'll never be kind of orphan descriptions in that sense. And one idea I kind of liked that was put out there, I think by you guys, Kat, was that idea of could we have legacy RAD descriptions where we don't even worry about converting them over and just say, yes, you can have that, that's fine, but here's what we recommend for going down the road to use. So we'll start with those.
Something that I guess is here, database migration assistance. That there are different ways I think that sort of could be dealt with, but I think, Dan, at one point you mentioned sort of a style sheet to change. If you're working with XML, for instance, I mean, it's I think, particularly if we're looking at sort of condensing elements, if there are descriptive elements in RAD that have their own sort of structure in EAD right now, and we're looking at combining them in some way, you kind of need a style sheet to do that work. And I think we should also make it very apparent to people who are using those kinds of tools that they're not perfect. Like, there's no way to sort of perfectly migrate data without error or data loss. And so it's the communication about tools that we're providing, I think, need to have that caution or disclaimer or whatever you want to call it. But I think it would be pretty simple if we have a new version of RAD that maps to EAD, it kind of needs to map to EAD the old version and the new one, and it's kind of a complex web of things, but I don't think it's an insurmountable task. If institutions that are going through that migration have the capacity to do that themselves and understand that they have to make their own decisions about certain issues, and be aware of the fact that they may lose data or lose granularity through the process.
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing that might be nice is if, there's going to be so many kind of borderline cases where you could do it one way, do it the other way. If at least there was some kind of, okay, here's what just kind of settled on. You don't have to reinvent that yourself every time. Each institution or each migration would at least have here's a kind of standard model for doing that.
And I would expect institutions that are leading this process will be also sending their people to conferences and writing about it. And I would hope, at least, that they can make that contribution as well. If converting your system to a revised version of RAD is a key priority for your institution, then you need to put the legwork in to do that and sort of be at the forefront of it and recognize that your use case or your approach to it will help inform other people who are either by not doing it the way that you decided to do it or adopting your sort of migration model.
If we're talking about a standard that's under the framework of ISAG, it's worth remembering that the current RAD already maps pretty well. A lot of what we're talking about is presentation and the structure and how one approaches the rules and navigates the rules, and not really a wholesale reinvention of the data elements.
Someone can probably quote me the rule number for this one in EAD or in ISAD. But we should also be able to flag RAD description as being compliant with RAD as the existing standard as opposed to whatever our new standard is. So there should be a way to flag in our database that this particular description complies with the standard.
Some of our members at ASA, like the smaller institutions, they were very concerned that they would need to get a new database or they would have to put a lot of resources into redescription. So I think whatever we do, we have to kind of ensure that it's not going to be a huge time and money commitment.
Although I think we can head some of that off by having really, really clear communication with the community and maybe doing like what they do with software when they update to major versions, say, this is what's changed, because I think that would help. And I've seen this happen with software that's come out of the States for archival things, description. They haven't communicated with the community, and it's been a disaster. So I would say communication would be great. Like, I think we could help people that way a lot by doing even just emails saying, hey, this is what we've done, just so everybody is in the loop. And even if they don't look at it at the time, when they're going to have to do it, they go, oh, what do I do? What do I do? And they're chickens without a head. And then they go, oh, yeah, that email, and it says what they've changed.
Just to add to that comment, and your concern about some of our members, there's so much anxiety around the issues of migration and this false idea that perfect migration is possible, and that if it breaks, like, you failed as a professional. So I would advocate, yes, the communication, but also having those case studies linked directly to whatever documentation we're creating, where not to say replace all the chapters if we decide to replace the chapters or if we decide to go with a different approach. I think linking case studies directly to the rules will help provide those roadmaps, those direct roadmaps for excuse me, institutions that are working on different registers. So the idea of, like, if you just want to copy and paste, here's a way to copy and paste every one of your legacy finding aids. If you're going to do a mass migration of several databases, here's an institution that's struggling with those issues right now. Because I think, talking to people in the past few weeks, the way they use RAD, I'm not sure if it came through in the survey, people use RAD in different ways, and they use the chapters often for examples. And I think in part because the community there's no central way of finding examples, and we don't have a habit or a tradition in some ways of publishing what we do and talking about our mistakes. So I advocate celebrating all of our, like, terrible mistakes related to migration, because then it creates that camaraderie and the idea that this is where it's not going to be perfect. You're going to fail. Let's fail together and publicly. So.
I do want to mention that I feel like in the U.S., the EAD technical subcommittee has actually done a great job of rolling out EAD 3 in terms of how they've been communicating, the tools that they've provided, the availability of subcommittee members and its chair on various forums and listservs for direct communication about how things have been done, the opportunities for feedback, and I think that we could probably learn a lot from just looking at how they've gone about that process. While I'm on the subject of EAD too, I think that in terms of developing crosswalks, that is a critical one that we standardize. There's, a very important relationship between content standards and metadata standards, and that's how we're managing exchange, is through our metadata standards. And I know that there was kind of the CCA one, but it was very high level and it left a lot of sub-elements open to interpretation. And because so much of RAD is currently in note forms, there's no direct correlation mapping those to EAD, which means people are mapping them either to a notes field with an attribute or an ODD element with an attribute. And that means that, you know, the way that's being implemented across the country varies wildly. And that makes issuing something like a style sheet to help with migrations very difficult unless we have a standardized crosswalk that people can check themselves against first and be like, will this style sheet work for me? What have I done differently? Where might it fail? What will I have to check for?
Yeah, the RBCM, we just finished migrating almost 1 million records into Atom over the last couple of years. And even though you could say that RAD had been implemented, the RBCM, the consistency in which it was applied over the last 15 to 20 years was left something to be desired. And so there was the migration issue often boiled down to the difficulties dealing with the legacy data that was the legacy descriptions. And in particular, the note fields, which you just mentioned, became these dumping grounds for things that people just didn't know what to do with when they were managing RAD. And that takes away the granularity of the utility of a relational database. But we're left with these enormous note fields with unstructured data. Just to give you a test case, we don't have anything to offer in terms of a crosswalk. It took us 2 years to figure it out, and we're still cleaning the data.
I think that's the message that needs to be communicated. I mean, like, if the same thing happened to us, we had all kinds of problems. And with working within a standards environment with experts who knew what they were doing, I mean, it's not a simple issue. The simplest thing may be the development of the template in Atom, probably, because, truly in Atom, you can switch between RAD and ISAG with very little issue, and I think that's a testament to how the application is built and what it does with the data and its reliance on EAD to sort of be an interchange model. And one thing that is occurring to me that we should probably consider doing before really getting into other crosswalking is look at RAD in relation to EAD3, because even though it seems unlikely that EAD3 will be implemented in something like Atom until we determine what we're doing here, we can't miss the boat there. Like, this is an opportunity for us to look at, what elements of RAD that didn't really work well within EAD2 would work better in EAD3, and how can EAD3 inform our own thinking about the use of ISAG as kind of the model that we're looking at. I don't think it would be a huge amount of work to revise of RAD to EAD3 crosswalk, because it hasn't completely changed, but there are some areas where it's substantially different. And I think we should kind of all have that information as we proceed.
One of the points raised in the community group response document was around whatever we are doing in terms of messaging about the revisions. We should always be very clear as to why we are doing this. I think that we are asking, or there is a necessity for an updating of this standard, and there should be a very simple, easy to digest, one-page response as to why this is necessary. There's 3 or 4 very obvious reasons that are reiterated throughout the literature and the survey responses and so on. And we should have some kind of a very clear statement about why this is necessary and why we're moving forward with it.
And I would echo that. I think for ACA members as well, a why statement is really, really important, because people are going to go, well, why? I would say, well, why are you doing this? Like, we all know it has issues, but why the big change in it, especially if they have to change software or, change the way they're doing certain things, maybe change a bit of software here and there. I think the why is really important.
Is there any thoughts about the idea of having legacy descriptions as being acceptable for a certain amount of time, where we didn't even? I mean, I think that might allay some people's fears, right? Where if you've got a database that's based on RAD, don't worry. It's we know how to map it over if we need to for the union list or for the catalogs. So it shouldn't be that big a deal if that was acceptable.
Again, I think that's an issue of the application, like the database. And yeah, I could see, for example, in Atom, we have ISAD-G, we have Dublin Core, we have RAD. We would be looking at a RAD2 template, basically. And, that seems like a fine approach to have them both at the, in there as options. But at some point, it's going to be difficult to maintain both of them in the application. And you're going to wonder, well, why are we maintaining a template for a deprecated standard? So there's like some period of time, and Dan may be able to speak to this a little bit better, but some period of time where they coexist in a community-supported open source application, but at some point it has to be kind of taken away. I mean, they can't coexist forever. Otherwise, like, what's the point of what we're doing?
Yeah, I was thinking less like with a product like Atom, where it's very easy to switch between the two. I don't think it would be a big deal to just take someone who's got their RAD descriptions and you switch the template and now they're compatible with the new standard. But it's more if someone's got their homegrown database that for them to convert it is going to be a huge task and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I would say that that's going to be the reality anyways, and it would be useful, I think, to have it come from the top down and say this is okay. It would probably allay some fears, but I mean, having helped assist in a lot of data migrations, I can tell you that there are still a lot of people in Canada who aren't RAD compliant anyways right now, and that standard's been out for a long time. So I think there'll be lots of people who will take their time in getting compliant with any revisions that we have, and I think that letting them know that that's kind of like understood will probably help it release some anxiety. Just in terms of addressing the Atom example, I just want to reemphasize again the value of a conceptual or like entity model. That's basically why Atom is able to flip standards so easily, is because when we were basing the application on the ICA standards first, we basically developed our own entity relationship model, and we tried to generalize that enough so that the application could grow and apply to other standards in the future. And when we talk about what comes after the current version of Atom, or thinking about future like applications, to have like an entity relationship model that conforms with the standard and is generalizable, that is developed by the community, I think is an incredibly useful tool that will make future applications much better at supporting this and dealing with future revisions.
Some of this too may be vendor directed, because I would think that whether we adopt a different standard in our practices, if we want our databases to conform, we're going to have to conform to the vendor's release schedule, and they're going to adopt the standard at the time that they feel is appropriate with their development of their applications. And so I suspect that for some database designers, they may develop tools that would allow to sort of demystify the migration process for their users in migrating from one standard to another. My database uses EAD as a mechanism for export for what we use to submit to Archives Canada. So that mechanism will likely be dependent upon the vendor's timeline, not necessarily on what we would say to our community in terms of the timetable for adoption.
I also think it's useful, again, to look at the other sort of related activities here and their own timelines. For example, with EAD3, it's been out for a little while now, but they only have now just released a beta version of the style sheet to do the migration. And I think you can't really release the beta migration style sheet until you finalized the standard. And so there is I'm sure that the people that wrote the style sheet were kind of working on it while the standard was in a draft form, or while certain portions of it were being finalized. But I don't think it's reasonable for the community to expect to have all of this land in their lap as a perfect solution to all of our problems. It needs to be a measured multi-year timeline that we're talking about, and particularly with those tools and the training and whatever else happens at the council level to sort of facilitate the migration. I wouldn't ever expect a new standard and all of the tools to kind of adopt it to happen all at once. I mean, it would be nice, but I don't know that it's reasonable.
I have to kind of wonder about the business model of us developing in a community a standard where we're bending over backwards to try and be cost effective, doing volunteer time, and then handing the standard over to vendors who then turn around and make a profit over laying out the new database. Is there some way that we cannot generate revenue in that relationship? I'm just throwing it out there.
We have tried, and it hasn't been effective till this point. But that's not to say that with changes occurring that we won't try that again. And maybe we'll consider a different model. Maybe it will be licensing to vendors or some approach. I'm not sure, but it's certainly, everything's on the table.
I find with these questions and the survey and so on, like, it's fairly abstract because we don't really know what we're transitioning to. So I don't have any objection if we wanted to move. Yeah, especially because one thing we're going to try to think about is what's the outcome of this meeting in terms of the report, and I'm not sure. So it might be nice to have a discussion around that too.
Okay, so before we go into the last part of the meeting, the wrap-up and things that are waiting for us in the future, I just wanted to ask if people from the observer's point of view had anything to add on this subject.
A little bit about like examples, and then maybe also examples of things not to do. As a student and also a newer user of RAD, I think the more examples there are, the better, just in terms of us trying to figure out what exactly they want from us. But also seeing maybe what not to do is just as helpful as seeing what to do. So yeah, that's something just as a newer user that would be beneficial. I know we've also had some experience using Atom, and the template structure is really helpful for us, just so that we're not randomly flipping through pages, which has also been discussed, like back and forth to chapter 1 over and over and over again. Having a designated template of what needs to be filled in is very useful just for new users.
I just thought of something in terms of transition as well, as there's the role for archival educators, right? Because we should be teaching arrangement and description as if it is in a period of transition, right? Which I know I have been doing, assuming that things are going to change and trying to get students to really think about what works with RAD and what doesn't work with RAD and what they would like to see. And so I think that's, if all of these years of students that are coming out in this transition period, they'll be more ready for, and they're often doing a lot of arrangement and description. So that's an important emphasis, I think, too, is to think about how we approach teaching standards as well.
Actually, one idea I know that came up from time to time in the survey, and we haven't really talked about it though, was, and it might be a transition strategy, was that idea of simple RAD that I know people have sort of talked about now and again, where we kind of identified what are the core elements of RAD as it is now, map those over to ISAT-G, and I mean, that might be a quick way to facilitate some kind of transition.
Yeah, we've been doing an exercise where we flip back and forth. We use Atom and we flip back and forth between the RAD template and the ISAT-G template and compare and see what's different and what's missing and what's emphasized in the different standards and stuff. And that's been really, I think it's been a good exercise, and also helping students see. So yeah. Thanks.
Point. In terms of describing the physical extent of electronic records, I know me and a lot of my class members have struggled a lot with that, just because RAD uses a lot of like or this, or this, or this. It's nice to have some sort of direction as to what's maybe preferred, or maybe it's totally arbitrary and doesn't matter what we're saying in that respect, but like something like if we have like 6 photos and they're TIFFs or they're JPEGs, or if you'd prefer like one USB drive full of this or this many gigabytes or terabytes of this, it might be useful to have like, we'd prefer it if you'd give the extent in gigabytes, and then like if gigabytes aren't available, if you'd give it in this, or if you want it more specific or less specific. I know just because we did an exercise where we described our own personal phone, and many of us, it was almost entirely electronic, and we didn't know if you wanted, or not you specifically, but if RAD wanted, if how they wanted us to express the physical extent of our own personal phone. So that would be helpful.
And following up on that, if we go with a standard and an implementation guide, we could get those kind of questions from the community, because we all have different, well, actually, we probably all have the same questions, just coming at it from slightly different views. We could answer questions like that. I think if we did the implementation guide as more of a dynamic guide, whereas the standard is always the standard, but the implementation guide can add things like if you're going to do tweets, or if you're going to do Instagram, or the newest thing that's come out. That way we could, I think, answer those kind of questions that are coming up on a daily basis.
So you say your phone was almost exclusively made up of digital elements?
Have a hybrid phone, like not encouraged, but try and find something you own that's not on your computer. So like,
is there part of your life that's not on a computer?
Maybe I'm really millennial, I don't know, but most things I have are digital. So like, I have kept essays marked from professors in the past, and that is a paper record because I keep the comments, but like all the syllabus, they're online. The reading lists are online. All of my essays I've submitted are online. So I have a huge drive on my computer that I labeled my academic series. And that's just full of like my reading notes from lectures, and that's all digital. So yeah, I have very few paper records, really.
Yeah, that's where we're heading, eh? I think someone wanted to...
Just to follow on that train of thought about preferred standards for measuring. I think this is a bit of a vested interest, but I think some institutions have reporting responsibilities to higher bodies. So if you're in a university archives, you're probably taking part in ridiculous exercises related to Arl and Carl stats. And it's an exercise in magic where you just sort of like this is how much we've acquired. I think this might be an opportunity to maybe think about, okay, if the standard is to create good data that users want, but maybe we want to create metrics that we can then aggregate at a higher level for advocacy purposes. Just a quick comment.
Are we going to need to have to convert electronic to equivalent volumes?
For the old CCA the old CCA Standards Committee, there was a working group on a standards metric I was the chair, and so some of those vexing issues where the standard diverges and you have questions of institutional reporting and developing mechanisms for consistent reporting of metrics. For many institutions, it boils down to the fact that their shelving units are an imperial measurement because it's a 3-foot shelf. And that's ultimately what it boils down to, as opposed to developing systems of metrics. So we could use, a metric, cubic meter measurements, but ultimately it's going to come down to the physical space that you have within your institution. But if ever the CCA Standards Committee comes back, that standard would come back or be finished.
I almost think this sort of goes back to the whole carrier content kind of problem of what are we actually counting sometimes, because I know in the past we've often, with our film holdings, we'll say originally we'd probably say we had 328 35 millimeter reels, but that actually translates into 100 film titles, right, that have maybe been on multiple elements, and it becomes really clear once you start digitizing that it didn't really make sense to express it as the physical extent in terms of counting objects. So
Okay. Well, I guess if one keyword can be used for this last session would be communication. Good communication, support for users, for migration, offering standardized crosswalks, but also look at what others did in terms of being there with our users to help them along the way towards the new standard, and that we should have a certain level of tolerance regarding legacy descriptions to be present for some time, so that we allay fears, amongst the members in the community. Voila. So my part is done. I will pass it on to Richard, which will handle the last part of our meeting.